The Rendlesham Forest Incident, a true UFO mystery. Welcome back to another journey into the unknown. Tonight, we're traveling across the Atlantic to a quiet stretch of woodland in Suffolk, England, where something extraordinary happened during the final days of December 1980. This is the story of the Rendlesham Forest Incident, often called Britain's Roswell, and it remains one of the most compelling and well-documented UFO encounters in history. Picture a dense pine forest in the dead of winter. The air is cold and still, frost clinging to every branch. It's the height of the Cold War, and this seemingly peaceful woodland sits between two of the most strategically important military installations in all of NATO. What happened here over 3 extraordinary nights would challenge everything we think we know about what's possible, and it involved not civilian witnesses prone to flights of fancy, but trained United States Air Force personnel, some of whom had top security clearances and worked with nuclear weapons. What makes this case so remarkable isn't just what people saw, but the sheer volume of evidence that emerged. We have official military memorandums, audio recordings made during the actual events, radiation readings, physical trace evidence, multiple trained military observers, and perhaps most intriguingly, a case where the United States government later acknowledged that at least one witness suffered genuine physical harm from his encounter, granting him full medical disability for injuries sustained that night. The setting: a Cold War powder keg. To understand what happened in Rendlesham Forest, you need to understand where it happened and why that location matters so profoundly. Rendlesham Forest is located in Suffolk, on England's eastern coast, about 8 miles from the town of Ipswich. It's a substantial woodland, covering approximately 6 square miles of mixed coniferous plantations, interspersed with broadleaf trees, heathland, and wetland areas. The forest has existed in various forms for centuries, and in different times it has served different purposes. But in December 1980, its most significant feature wasn't its natural beauty or its history. It was what lay on either side of it. On the forest's western edge sat RAF Woodbridge, and just to the north was RAF Bentwaters. Though they carried Royal Air Force designations, both bases were actually operated by the United States Air Force under a special arrangement with the British government. They were known as the Twin Bases, and they operated essentially as a single military installation split across 2 airfields. This wasn't just any military base. This was, at the height of the Cold War, one of the largest NATO Air Force installations in Europe. The official line, the one repeated in public statements and official documents, was that these bases housed conventional fighter aircraft and conducted routine defensive operations. The reality, known to those who served there but never officially acknowledged, was considerably more serious. RAF Bentwaters contained a weapons storage area, a highly secured compound protected by triple fences, guard towers, dog patrols, and around-the-clock security. Inside those earthen bunkers, hidden beneath mounds of soil and concrete, sat tactical nuclear weapons. These weren't the massive city-destroying warheads of intercontinental ballistic missiles, but smaller tactical nukes designed to be delivered by fighter aircraft against military targets in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The presence of these weapons transformed these bases from simple military airfields into strategic targets of the highest order. The security protocols were intense. Armed security police patrolled the perimeters constantly. Intrusion attempts would be met with overwhelming force. The tension was real and constant because everyone stationed there understood what was at stake. If war came, if the Cold War turned hot, these bases would be among the first targets struck by Soviet forces. The weapons stored there represented both a defensive necessity and an invitation to preemptive attack. In December 1980, the bases were operating with reduced staffing due to the Christmas holidays. Many personnel were on leave, visiting family, or enjoying what little downtime military life in the Cold War allowed. Those who remained, the skeleton crew, keeping the bases operational during the holiday period, found themselves working longer shifts, covering for absent colleagues, maintaining the constant vigilance that nuclear weapons demanded even during peacetime. The weather that late December was typical of an English winter. Cold, dark, and often foggy. The sun set early, leaving long hours of darkness. The forest itself, so close to the bases, was a place most personnel gave little thought to. It was just there, a dark mass of trees beyond the fence line, occasionally visible through the mist, a natural barrier between the bases and the surrounding countryside. This was the world in which the events of late December 1980 would unfold. A world of Cold War tensions, nuclear weapons, highly trained military personnel, and a dark forest that was about to become the setting for one of the most extraordinary series of encounters in modern history. The first night, December 26, 1980. The first incident began in the early morning hours of December 26, 1980, Boxing Day in British tradition, the day after Christmas. The time was approximately 3 o'clock in the morning. At the east gate of RAF Woodbridge, security police were conducting their routine patrol of the perimeter. These weren't raw recruits or inexperienced guards. These were trained Air Force security police, men whose job was to protect one of the most sensitive military installations in NATO. They knew the area. They knew what belonged and what didn't. They knew the difference between ordinary lights and something unusual. What they saw that night was unusual. According to the reports, the security patrol observed strange lights apparently descending into Rendlesham Forest. The lights were bright, brighter than ordinary aircraft lights, and they seemed to be coming down among the trees to the east of the base. The initial assumption, the one that made the most sense given their training and experience, was that an aircraft had crashed. Perhaps a small civilian plane had gone down in the forest, or maybe military aircraft experiencing difficulties had attempted an emergency landing in the trees. The patrol called it in, reporting the sighting to their superiors. Permission was granted to investigate. A team was assembled. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, a security supervisor with extensive military experience, was one of those selected. With him were Airman First Class John Burroughs and Airman First Class Ed Cabansag. They were authorized to leave the base on foot to investigate what they presumed was a downed aircraft. What happened next depends somewhat on whose account you believe, because over the years, the stories have evolved and changed in certain details. But the core elements remain consistent. The three men left the east gate and entered Rendlesham Forest, moving toward the location where the lights had been seen descending. Cabansag remained near their vehicle, maintaining radio contact, serving as a relay point between the men in the forest and the base. This was standard procedure. Burroughs and Peniston continued deeper into the woods, following the strange lights they could see between the trees. What they described encountering defies easy explanation. According to Peniston's account, as they moved through the forest, they became aware of unusual environmental effects. The animals on nearby farms were going wild, making sounds of distress that carried through the cold night air. Livestock don't typically panic without reason, and the reports of animals reacting with extreme agitation to the presence of something in the forest would be corroborated by other witnesses and mentioned in official reports. As the two men proceeded, they saw lights ahead of them, moving between the trees. Multicolored lights, red and blue and white, pulsing and shifting. They followed these lights deeper into the forest, and then, in a clearing, they saw it. Peniston's description, given initially in official statements and later elaborated in interviews and books, describes a craft. Not an aircraft in any conventional sense, but an object that seemed to defy normal categories. He described it as triangular in shape, approximately 2 to 3 meters across at the base and about 2 meters high. It appeared to rest on 3 legs, or landing pods. The surface was dark, possibly black, and seemed almost glassy or metallic, difficult to categorize in conventional terms. Most strikingly, it was covered in symbols, hieroglyphic-like markings that resembled nothing Peniston had ever seen. According to Peniston's account, he approached the object. He drew close enough to touch it. He described the surface as warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air temperature would suggest. He placed his hand on the symbols, and when he did, he experienced something extraordinary. Images flooded his mind, sequences of ones and zeros, binary code, streaming through his consciousness. This experience, he would later claim, was like a telepathic download of information directly into his brain. The object, according to both Peniston and Burroughs, remained in the clearing for some time. Then, suddenly, it lifted off. Not with the roar of jet engines or the whomp of helicopter rotors, but silently, or nearly so. It rose up through the trees and vanished into the night sky at incredible speed. The two men, shaken by what they'd witnessed, returned to the base. They reported what they'd seen. And this is where things get interesting from an evidentiary standpoint. When they returned, they discovered something odd. Their watches were off. Time seemed to have passed differently than they'd experienced it. What had felt like perhaps 45 minutes in the forest had actually been several hours. Now, at this point, you might think that such an extraordinary report would trigger an immediate and massive investigation. But remember the context. This was a highly classified military installation during the Cold War. The immediate response was focused more on security than investigation. Had there been a genuine intrusion? Was this some kind of Soviet provocation or intelligence operation? The men were debriefed. They were questioned. And according to their later accounts, they were told to keep quiet about what they'd seen while an official investigation was conducted. Physical evidence and morning light. When daylight came on December 26th, a return visit to the forest site was made. What was found there added another layer of complexity to an already bizarre situation. In the clearing where Peniston and Burroughs reported seeing the triangular craft, investigators found 3 indentations in the ground, arranged in a triangular pattern consistent with a 3-legged landing apparatus. The depressions were visible, measurable, and they were photographed and documented. Each depression was roughly circular, pressed into the cold, hard earth with enough force to leave a lasting impression. Additionally, damage was noted to nearby trees. Branches were broken, and there appeared to be burn marks or scoring on some of the tree trunks at approximately head height. The branches that were broken suggested something large had moved through the area, perhaps rising up through the tree canopy. The marks on the trees were harder to explain. They appeared to show signs of heat or some form of energy, scorching the bark in patterns that seemed unusual. At approximately 10:30 in the morning on December 26, the local Suffolk police were called to the scene. This detail is important because it provides an independent civilian perspective on the physical evidence. The police officers who responded to the call examined the site. Their assessment, documented in their reports, was considerably more mundane than the military witnesses' accounts. The ground depressions, in the police officers' opinion, could easily have been made by animals, possibly rabbits or other forest creatures digging in the earth. The marks on the trees, they noted, were consistent with cuts made by foresters marking trees for future felling, a common forestry practice. A local forester, Vince Thurkettle, who worked in Rendlesham Forest, would later report that in the days following the incident, he was approached by two men in suits who questioned him extensively about whether he had been in the forest on the nights in question and whether he had seen anything unusual. Thurkettle, who had not been working those nights, told them he'd seen nothing. The men thanked him and left. It wasn't until 3 years later, when the story finally broke in the press, that Thurkettle understood what they had been asking about. This discrepancy between the military witnesses' interpretation of the evidence and the civilian authorities' assessment highlights one of the central challenges in evaluating the Rendlesham Forest incident. The physical evidence exists. The marks were there. The question is what caused them. Were they the landing impressions of an unknown craft? Or were they rabbit holes and foresters' marks misinterpreted by men who had just experienced something unusual and frightening in the dark forest? What cannot be disputed is that something happened in those woods that night. Multiple military personnel saw something. They were sufficiently concerned to report it through official channels. Physical marks were found at the location they indicated. The question isn't whether something occurred, but rather what that something was. Cast, the second night. Lieutenant Colonel Halt's investigation. 2 nights later, on the evening of December 27th, running into the early morning hours of December 28th, 1980, the situation escalated dramatically. Reports came in of more unusual lights in the forest, in the same general area where the initial sighting had occurred. This time, the response would include a much more senior officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles "The Halt, the Deputy Base Commander of RAF Bentwaters. Charles Halt was not some junior officer or enlisted man who might be prone to mistakes or misidentification. He was a senior officer, a veteran of the Vietnam War, a man with extensive military experience and a reputation for level-headedness and competence. He was also initially skeptical about the whole affair. When word reached him of more lights in the forest, his first instinct was probably that this was some kind of misunderstanding, possibly even a prank. Nevertheless, he decided to investigate personally, if only to put the matter to rest. Halt assembled a team and equipped himself with a micro-cassette recorder, a small handheld device he typically used for making notes and reminders. This decision to bring the recorder would prove to be one of the most important evidentiary elements of the entire case, because Halt recorded the investigation as it happened. The tape that would later become known as the Halt tape provides a real-time audio document of extraordinary events. The team that accompanied Halt included several other airmen, among them Sergeant Monroe Nevels, who operated a radiation detector, and Bruce England, a local forester who helped guide the group through the forest. The group left the base and entered Rendlesham Forest, heading toward the location of the reported lights. The halt tape, which would later be released to researchers and eventually to the public, captures the investigation as it unfolded. You can hear the men walking through the forest, discussing what they're seeing, taking measurements, and reacting to unexpected phenomena. The recording is fragmentary, with many gaps where Halt turned the recorder on and off to conserve tape. But what it captures is remarkable. Early in the tape, Halt and his team arrive at the location where the ground depressions had been found 2 nights earlier. They examine the marks, measuring them, discussing their layout. Then Nevels begins taking radiation readings with the AN-PDR-27, a standard military radiation survey meter. The meter detects slightly elevated radiation levels at the site of the depressions, readings of about 0.07 milliroentgens per hour, compared to background readings of 0.03 to 0.04 in the surrounding area. To put this in perspective, these are very low radiation levels, not dangerous to human health, but measurably above normal background. Here's where we need to pause and address what these radiation readings actually mean. Experts have subsequently pointed out that the AN-PDR-27 was designed to measure high levels of radiation, the kind you'd encounter in a nuclear emergency or near a radiation source. At the very low end of its measurement scale, in the range of normal background radiation, the device was not particularly accurate or reliable. The slightly elevated readings could have been caused by numerous factors: variations in the natural radioactivity of the soil, nearby fertilizers used in farming, or even just the statistical variation in background radiation that occurs naturally. Some skeptics have argued that these readings are essentially meaningless, that the equipment being used at the low end of its range makes the measurements unreliable. On the other hand, defenders of the anomalous explanation point out that even if the absolute numbers are questionable, the fact that there was a measurable difference between the depression sites and the surrounding area is notable. Something about those specific locations was different from the surrounding forest floor. But the radiation readings, controversial as they are, represent just a small part of what Halt and his team experienced that night. Because as they were conducting their investigation, things took a dramatic turn. Somewhere in the forest, the men spotted a light, a pulsing red light that seemed to move between the trees. The Halt tape captures their reactions in real time. You can hear the excitement and confusion in their voices as they try to track this light. Halt describes it as dripping what looks like molten metal. The light pulses, expands, contracts, and then breaks into separate pieces. The men pursue it through the forest, trying to get close enough to identify it. At one point, Halt observes that the light is in the direction of a nearby farmhouse, and beyond that, toward the coast. This detail becomes important later in skeptical analyses of the event. Because the Orford Ness Lighthouse lay in that same direction, approximately 5 miles distant on the Suffolk coast. Could what they were seeing simply be the lighthouse beam, visible through gaps in the trees? But then Halt reports something that's harder to explain away. He describes seeing additional lights in the sky, star-like objects, but behaving unlike any stars. 2 lights to the north, 1 to the south, hovering at about 10 degrees above the horizon. One of these lights, he says, seems to be beaming down streams of light from time to time, thin beams that descend from the hovering object toward the ground. On the tape, you can hear Halt becoming increasingly animated. There's there's two strange objects, half moon shape, dancing about with colored lights, he says at one point. Another voice, one of the men with him, exclaims, "Colors," with evident amazement. Halt responds with a laugh that sounds more nervous than amused. This is unreal. Later in the recording, Halt makes one of the most striking observations captured on tape. He reports seeing what appears to be a beam of light coming down from one of the objects toward the ground. Some accounts suggest this beam was directed toward the weapons storage area back at the base, where nuclear weapons were stored, though this detail is more prominent in later retellings than in the original tape. The entire recorded sequence spans about 18 minutes of actual tape, but it covers activities over a period of several hours. Halt repeatedly turned the recorder on and off to conserve tape, capturing what he judged to be the most important moments. The result is a fragmentary but compelling audio document of men experiencing something they couldn't explain or identify. When dawn came and the team returned to the base, Halt was faced with a decision about how to handle what they'd experienced. This wasn't just strange lights reported by junior enlisted men. This was something witnessed by a lieutenant colonel, the deputy base commander, along with multiple other personnel. This was something that needed to be reported up the chain of command. The Halt Memo, official documentation. On January 13, 1981, more than 2 weeks after the incidents, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt sat down and wrote a memorandum, addressed to the Royal Air Force and intended for the UK Ministry of Defence. This memo would become known as the Halt Memo, and it remains one of the most important pieces of documentation in UFO history. The memo is remarkably concise, just one page, yet it documents extraordinary claims in the dry, bureaucratic language of official military communication. It begins, early in the morning of 27-80, 2 USAF security police patrolmen saw unusual lights outside the back gate at RAF Woodbridge. The memo goes on to describe the investigation by the 3 airmen, the discovery of the triangular object, and the physical evidence found the next day. It mentions the ground depressions, describes them as being arranged in a triangular pattern, and notes the broken branches on nearby trees. Crucially, it documents the radiation readings taken on the second night, stating that the readings taken in the 3 depressions were significantly higher than the average background. The memo concludes by describing the lights observed on the second night. Later in the night, a red sun-like light was seen through the trees. It moved about and pulsed. At one point, it appeared to throw off glowing particles, and then broke into 5 separate white objects, and then disappeared. Immediately thereafter, 3 star-like objects were noticed in the sky, 2 objects to the north and 1 to the south, all of which were about 10 degrees off the horizon. The objects moved rapidly in sharp angular movements and displayed red, green, and blue lights. The objects to the north appeared to be elliptical through an 8 to 12 power lens. They then turned to full circles. The objects to the north remained in the sky for an hour or more. The object to the south was visible for 2 or 3 hours and beamed down a stream of light from time to time. What's remarkable about this memo is its official nature. This wasn't a sensational tabloid story or the claims of an attention-seeking individual. This was an official United States Air Force document written by a senior officer reporting unexplained phenomena at a highly classified military installation. And yet, when Halt sent this memo to the Ministry of Defense, the response he received was underwhelming. The UK Ministry of Defense acknowledged receipt of the memo, but took little apparent action to investigate further. Their official position, stated then and maintained for years afterward, was that the incident posed no threat to national security and therefore did not warrant detailed investigation. This response has been interpreted different ways by different people. Skeptics see it as evidence that the MOD quickly determined there was a mundane explanation and saw no reason to waste resources investigating. Believers in an extraterrestrial or otherwise anomalous explanation see it as evidence of a cover-up, an official desire to minimize and dismiss an incident that was, in fact, quite significant. What's particularly interesting is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. The memo was filed away. It was not classified, but neither was it publicized. It simply sat in Ministry of Defense files, unnoticed by the public, unknown to the press, gathering dust while the years passed. The men who had witnessed these events returned to their regular duties. They were, according to their later accounts, told to keep quiet about what they'd seen. This wasn't presented as a sinister cover-up, so much as a practical matter of military security and personal reputation. Talking about seeing UFOs was not a career-enhancing move in the military. Better to keep quiet, focus on your job, and let the matter be handled by those whose job it was to handle such things. And that might have been the end of it. The Rendlesham Forest incident might have remained an obscure footnote, a classified incident known only to those directly involved, if not for one crucial factor, the United States Freedom of Information Act. The public revelation. In 1983, 3 years after the events, a copy of the Halt memo was obtained by researchers using the Freedom of Information Act. When the document was made public, it caused an immediate sensation. Here was official documentation of a UFO incident written by a senior military officer, describing events at one of the most sensitive military installations in Europe. The media descended on the story. The News of the World, a British tabloid, ran a front-page headline, "UFO lands in Suffolk." Suddenly, the Rendlesham Forest incident was no longer a secret. The witnesses, who had been told to keep quiet, found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Some of them, including Halt himself, began speaking more openly about what they'd experienced. The story started to spread, gathering details, and, inevitably, some embellishments and contradictions along the way. One of the first civilians to investigate the case in depth was UFO researcher Brenda Butler, who began looking into the incident soon after hearing rumors about it from contacts in the area. Together with fellow researchers Dot Street and Jenny Randalls, Butler would eventually write the first book about the case, Sky Crash, A Cosmic Conspiracy, published in 1984. As researchers dug into the story, they uncovered more details. They tracked down witnesses, both military and civilian. They interviewed local residents who had noticed unusual activity at the bases during those December nights. They visited the forest, examined the site, and tried to piece together exactly what had happened. The story that emerged was complex and in some ways contradictory. Different witnesses remembered events slightly differently. Some details that one person remembered clearly were fuzzy or absent in another's recollection. This is actually quite normal with eyewitness testimony, especially involving events that occurred years earlier, but it gave ammunition to skeptics who argued that the inconsistencies proved the story was unreliable or fabricated. One of the most striking developments came years later. In 2010, 30 years after the incident, Jim Peniston revealed something he claimed to have kept secret all that time. He produced his notebook from the night of the incident, and in it were pages and pages of ones and zeros. Binary code. Peniston claimed that when he touched the symbols on the craft, he had experienced a kind of telepathic download, and in the hours and days after the incident, he found himself compelled to write down these sequences of binary digits. He didn't know what they meant at the time, but he wrote them down, filling 16 pages of his notebook. The binary code mystery. The binary code revelation added a whole new dimension to the Rendlesham Forest story, and it remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Let's examine what Peniston claimed, what the code allegedly contains, and why many people, including some who believe something extraordinary happened at Rendlesham, view this element with considerable skepticism. According to Peniston, in the days following his encounter with the craft in the forest, he experienced vivid, intrusive thoughts. Images of ones and zeros kept appearing in his mind's eye, particularly when he was trying to sleep. To get relief from these persistent mental images, he began writing them down in his notebook, transcribing the binary sequences that seemed to be downloaded into his mind during his contact with the craft. For 30 years, Peniston claims, he kept these pages of binary code secret. He feared that revealing them would destroy his credibility, that people would think he was mentally unstable, that it would end his career and mark him as delusional. Only in 2010, on the 30th anniversary of the incident, did he finally go public with the binary code pages. When the code was subjected to analysis by computer experts, specifically using standard 7-bit ASCII encoding, a message emerged. The decoded text read, "Exploration of Humanity 666-8100." This was followed by a series of geographic coordinates pointing to specific locations around the world. The locations include a point off the coast of Ireland, where the legendary Phantom Island of High Brazil was said to exist, Caracol, Belize, site of ancient Mayan ruins, Sedona, Arizona, long considered a site of spiritual significance, the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, the Nazca Lines in Peru, Taishanku in China, site of sacred mountains, the Portara, gateway to the Temple of Apollo in Naxos, Greece. The phrase "eyes of your eyes" also appears in the decoded message, along with the mysterious year 8100, which some have interpreted as suggesting the message comes not from extraterrestrial aliens, but from human time travelers from the year 8100. Now, this is where things get both fascinating and problematic. On one hand, the idea that the Rendlesham incident involved contact with beings or technology from our own future rather than from another planet is certainly an interesting hypothesis. It would explain why any messages or communications would be in English and use human coordinate systems. The specific sites referenced in the coordinates are all places of historical, archaeological, or spiritual significance, which could make sense if future humans were trying to communicate something about humanity's past or its important cultural locations. On the other hand, the entire binary code story raises significant red flags for several reasons. First, there's the timing. Peniston says he kept this information secret for 30 years. During all the interviews he gave, all the documentaries he participated in, all the books written about Rendlesham, he never mentioned this binary code. He never hinted at having received any kind of message. The story only emerged decades after the fact, after the Rendlesham case was already well established in UFO literature, after numerous theories and interpretations had been published. Second, his explanation for the date and time shown in his notebook doesn't match the physical evidence. The notebook shows 27 December and 12:20 at the start of his notes about encountering the craft. But the encounter occurred on the night of December 26th, not December 27th. When this discrepancy was pointed out, Peniston changed his story, saying the date and time marked when he wrote down the binary code, not when the encounter happened. But if you look at the notebook itself, the date and time appear at the start of the craft description, not at the start of the binary code pages. Third, and perhaps most problematically, none of the other witnesses from that night corroborate the binary code story. John Burroughs, who was with Peniston during the encounter, has explicitly stated that Peniston was not taking notes in a notebook during the incident. In an email to researcher Ian Ridpath, Burroughs wrote, "Peniston did not have time to make any sketches in a notebook while this was going on, and did not walk around it for 45-minute bursts." Lieutenant Colonel Halt, who had examined Peniston's notebook multiple times, including while filming a 2003 documentary, stated in 2019, "I handled the notebook several times, including while filming the 2003 program. No code or missing pages." Fourth, there are technical problems with the binary code itself. Computer security expert Kevin Boone has analyzed the code and pointed out several issues that make it seem unlikely to be a genuine transmission from advanced beings. The encoding uses a simplistic, conventional number representation with no error detection or correction, making it unreliable for communication. The binary digits are grouped into blocks of 8, bytes, which is standard for human computers, but wasteful for communication purposes, as ASCII only requires 7 bits. Perhaps most tellingly, the message is in English only, uses ASCII encoding developed by humans in the 1960s, and contains formatting quirks that are distinctly human in origin. The binary code mystery illustrates one of the challenges in evaluating the Rendlesham Forest incident. Here we have a genuine UFO case with multiple military witnesses, official documentation, and physical evidence. But layered on top of it are elements that seem questionable, stories that emerge long after the fact, claims that can't be verified and aren't corroborated by other witnesses. This mixing of potentially genuine anomalous events with later additions and embellishments makes it difficult to separate what actually happened from what people have come to believe happened, or what they've convinced themselves happened in the decades since. Many researchers who take the Rendlesham case seriously believe that something extraordinary did occur in those woods in December 1980, but they view the binary code story with considerable skepticism. It's possible that Peniston genuinely experienced something traumatic and bizarre, and that over the years, his memories and interpretations of that experience have evolved and incorporated new elements. This is not unusual with extraordinary experiences. The human mind has a tendency to fill in gaps, to create narratives that make sense of confusing events, to add coherence to fragmentary memories. Medical consequences, the John Burroughs story. While the binary code story added controversy to the Rendlesham case, another development would add a different kind of credibility. The medical consequences experienced by witnesses, particularly Airman First Class John Burroughs. John Burroughs was one of the first men to enter Rendlesham Forest on that December night in 1980. He was there with Peniston when they encountered whatever it was in the clearing. In the years that followed, Burroughs would experience serious health problems that he believed were directly connected to his exposure during the incident. Starting in the years after the Rendlesham incident, Burroughs began experiencing cardiac problems. His heart would race inexplicably. He experienced chest pains, irregular rhythms, and symptoms that indicated something was seriously wrong with his cardiovascular system. By the time he was in his late 40s and early 50s, his condition had deteriorated significantly. Medical examinations revealed congestive heart failure and damage to his heart that doctors couldn't easily explain, given his age and medical history. Burroughs believed his heart problems were connected to whatever he'd been exposed to in Rendlesham Forest. Perhaps it was radiation, though the levels, measured on the second night, were relatively low. Perhaps it was some other form of energy, something not easily detected by conventional instruments. Whatever the cause, Burroughs was convinced his military service had damaged his health, and he filed a claim with the Department of Veterans Affairs for disability benefits. This is where the story takes a remarkable turn. When the VA processed Burroughs' claim, they requested his complete military medical records to evaluate his case. But when they sought those records from the Department of Defense, they encountered a problem. Burroughs' medical records from his time at RAF Woodbridge, covering the period when the incident occurred, were classified. The VA couldn't access them to evaluate his claim. Think about what this means. Medical records, the routine documentation of a serviceman's health status, examinations, and treatments, were classified. Not missing, not lost. Classified. Someone, at some point, had decided that John Burroughs' medical records from that period needed to be kept secret, restricted from normal access, even from the Veterans Affairs Administration processing a disability claim. For years, Burroughs fought to get his records declassified and to receive the medical care and compensation he believed he was owed. His case might have languished in bureaucratic limbo if not for the intervention of Senator John McCain of Arizona. McCain, a veteran himself and a prominent member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, took an interest in Burroughs' case. With McCain's assistance, pressure was applied to the Department of Defense to address the situation. In 2015, 35 years after the incident, the United States government granted John Burroughs full medical disability related to his time at RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge. The VA acknowledged that his heart damage was connected to his military service during that period. While the official documentation didn't explicitly state injured by UFO, the implications were clear. Something had happened to Burroughs during his service at those bases. Something that caused lasting physical harm, and the government was acknowledging it. This development is significant for several reasons. First, it provides a form of official validation that something happened at Rendlesham. The government doesn't grant full medical disability based on imaginary events. Second, the classification of Burroughs' medical records suggests there was something about the incident or about what happened to him during the incident that someone deemed sensitive enough to restrict. Third, it demonstrates that whatever occurred in Rendlesham Forest may have had real, measurable physical consequences for those exposed to it. Other witnesses have also reported health issues. Some have experienced problems with their eyes, suffering from unusual sensitivities or deterioration. Some have reported ongoing psychological effects, including vivid dreams, intrusive thoughts, and anxiety related to the events. Whether all of these health issues are genuinely connected to the Rendlesham incident or are the result of other factors is difficult to determine. But the fact that the government acknowledged Burroughs' injuries and granted him disability adds weight to the claims that the Rendlesham Forest incident had real physical consequences. The medical angle also raises uncomfortable questions. If exposure during the incident caused measurable physical harm, what exactly were these men exposed to? Standard explanations involving lighthouses, meteors, or misidentified conventional aircraft don't typically cause heart damage decades later. Even if we accept that some form of radiation was present, the measured levels were too low to account for serious long-term health effects. So what was it? What form of energy or phenomenon could cause lasting damage but not be readily identified by standard instruments? These are questions that remain unanswered, adding another layer of mystery to an already complex case. Skeptical explanations? The conventional interpretation. Any honest examination of the Rendlesham Forest incident must address the skeptical explanations that have been proposed over the years. Several researchers, most notably British UFO skeptic Ian Ridpath, have argued that the events at Rendlesham have entirely mundane explanations, and that the mystery is more a matter of misperception and misidentification than genuine anomaly. Let's examine the main skeptical explanations and evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. The most prominent conventional explanation for the light seen during the Rendlesham incident involves the Orford Ness Lighthouse. This lighthouse sits on the Suffolk coast, approximately 5 miles from the Rendlesham Forest location where the events occurred. The lighthouse beam is powerful and rotates, sending a bright flash of light sweeping across the landscape every 5 seconds. From certain positions in Rendlesham Forest, particularly in areas where the trees are less dense, the lighthouse beam would have been visible. Ian Ridpath and other skeptics argue that what the witnesses saw, particularly during the second night when Halt was present, was primarily the lighthouse beam visible through the trees. They point out that on the Halt tape, when he describes the pulsing red light, the timing of the pulses matches the rotation rate of the Orford Ness Lighthouse. The direction in which Halt observed the light also corresponds to the direction of the lighthouse from that location in the forest. To support this explanation, skeptics note that local residents who live in the area and are familiar with the lighthouse beam have stated that newcomers to the area sometimes mistake the lighthouse for something unusual, particularly when seeing it for the first time through trees or fog. The beam can appear to move when you move, creating an illusion that it's following you or deliberately pacing your movement through the forest. This is simply an effect of changing perspective as you move relative to a distant light source. There's considerable merit to this explanation. The lighthouse was there. It was operating that night. Its beam would have been visible from parts of the forest, and the behavior described in some portions of the Halt tape, particularly the regular pulsing, does match what you'd expect from a rotating lighthouse beam. However, the lighthouse explanation has significant limitations. For one thing, Halt and his men weren't unfamiliar with the area. The base had been operating there for years. While individual personnel rotated through, it's unlikely that no one in the group had ever noticed the lighthouse before. Additionally, the lighthouse beam doesn't explain the initial incident on the first night, when Peniston and Burroughs reported encountering a physical craft on the ground. A lighthouse beam, no matter how bright or how strange it appears through trees, doesn't land in a clearing and leave physical ground traces. The skeptical explanation for the first night's events involves a bright meteor or fireball that was observed over southern England at approximately 3 in the morning on December 26, 1980. This fireball was seen by numerous witnesses across a wide area and was bright enough to light up the night sky. Skeptics argue that this fireball, appearing to descend toward the horizon in the direction of Rendlesham Forest, was what the security patrol initially saw and interpreted as lights descending into the forest. Once the airmen entered the forest, believing they were investigating a crashed aircraft, skeptics argue they became victims of misperception in the dark, unfamiliar environment. The lights they saw moving between the trees could have been a combination of several factors. The lighthouse beam, visible in the distance, stars seen through breaks in the clouds and trees, and possibly even the bright star Sirius, which would have been visible in that part of the sky at that time of night. Sirius is known for appearing to twinkle with multiple colors, particularly when seen through atmospheric disturbance or when low on the horizon, and it could account for some of the colored lights described by the witnesses. As for the physical traces, the ground depressions and tree damage, skeptics point to the assessment made by the Suffolk police who examined the site the morning after the first incident. The police concluded that the depressions were consistent with rabbit diggings, which are common in that forest. The marks on the trees, they noted, matched cuts made by foresters to mark trees for future felling. When the local forester, Vince Thurkettle, was later interviewed, he confirmed that such marks were routine in his work and that the damaged trees could easily be explained by normal forestry activities combined with the airmen crashing through the underbrush in the dark. The skeptical explanation for the radiation readings involves the limitations of the detection equipment being used at very low levels, combined with natural variations in background radiation. Some have suggested that the slightly elevated readings could have been caused by the use of agricultural fertilizers on nearby farms, as certain fertilizers contain naturally occurring radioactive elements that can cause slightly elevated readings. Others have pointed out that the forest floor itself, with its composition of organic matter, different types of soil, and natural minerals, can produce variations in radiation levels that are within the normal range but measurable. The time distortion reported by witnesses, particularly the feeling that less time had passed than actually had, can be explained by the stress and excitement of the situation. Time perception is notoriously unreliable during high-stress events. What feels like minutes can be hours, and vice versa. The malfunctioning watches could be coincidental, or could have been affected by the cold, damp conditions of a December night in an English forest. The animals going wild, frequently cited as corroborating evidence of something unusual, could have been reacting to the presence of the men moving through the forest, or to any number of other stimuli that occur in rural areas at night. Farm animals are sensitive creatures and can be disturbed by predators, unfamiliar humans, or even just atmospheric changes that humans don't notice. As for the official documentation, the halt memo, and the military response, skeptics argue that none of this proves anything anomalous occurred. Military personnel can be mistaken. Senior officers are not immune to misperception. The fact that Halt wrote an official memo simply means he believed something unusual had occurred and felt it was his duty to report it. The fact that the Ministry of Defense didn't launch a major investigation suggests they quickly satisfied themselves that no genuine security threat existed. The skeptical case is coherent and comprehensive. It accounts for each element of the story with conventional explanations. It doesn't require us to accept the existence of phenomena unknown to science. It simply requires us to accept that trained military personnel, in stressful and unfamiliar circumstances, misperceived conventional phenomena as something extraordinary. But here's where the skeptical explanation faces its greatest challenge: the totality of the evidence and the credibility of the witnesses. Yes, individual elements of the story can be explained conventionally. The lighthouse accounts for some lights. The meteor accounts for the initial sighting. Rabbit holes and Forrester's marks account for the physical traces. But when you take everything together, the entirety of the witness testimony, the physical evidence, the official documentation, the medical consequences, and the sustained interest of multiple trained military observers over the course of 3 nights, the conventional explanation starts to feel strained. Could experienced security personnel, whose job was to distinguish real threats from false alarms, really mistake a lighthouse beam for a landed craft with hieroglyphic symbols? Could a senior officer, a lieutenant colonel with years of military experience, spend hours in the forest tracking what was just a lighthouse beam and stars, record his observations on tape, and not realize his mistake? Could the government grant full medical disability to John Burroughs for injuries sustained while chasing rabbits and looking at lighthouses? Each individual element, viewed in isolation, can be explained. But the constellation of events, viewed as a whole, resists easy dismissal. This is the crux of the Rendlesham Forest incident. It's not a case that can be definitively proved or disproved. It's a case that sits in that uncomfortable middle ground where conventional explanations are possible but feel incomplete, and anomalous explanations are compelling but unprovable. The evolution of witness testimony. One of the most challenging aspects of evaluating the Rendlesham Forest incident is the way witness accounts have evolved over the decades. This evolution is actually quite normal in cases involving traumatic or unusual events, but it complicates our ability to determine what actually happened. When we look at the earliest accounts, the ones given immediately after the events or in the weeks and months that followed, they are generally more restrained and less detailed than the accounts given years or decades later. This pattern is evident across multiple witnesses. Jim Peniston's account, for example, has expanded considerably over the years. In his initial written statement, given shortly after the incident, he described seeing a strange light in the forest, but provided relatively few details about the physical characteristics of any craft. In later accounts, particularly in books and documentaries produced years after the event, his description became much more elaborate, including detailed information about the triangular shape, the hieroglyphic symbols, and his physical contact with the craft. The binary code story, as we've discussed, didn't emerge until 30 years after the incident. This evolution of testimony can be interpreted in different ways. Skeptics argue that it represents the gradual embellishment and mythologizing of a relatively mundane event. As time passes, memories become less reliable, and people can unconsciously incorporate details they've read or heard from other sources. The UFO narrative, skeptics suggest, grew and developed as witnesses learned more about other UFO cases. As they gave interviews and were asked leading questions, and as they became part of the UFO research community, where certain types of details and experiences are expected and valued. Believers in the anomalous explanation offer a different interpretation. They argue that the initial, more restrained accounts were the result of deliberate downplaying due to military pressure and personal fear of ridicule. As time has passed and witnesses have become more comfortable speaking publicly, they've felt free to share details they previously held back. Additionally, some researchers argue that experiences this traumatic and unusual can be partially suppressed, with full memories returning only gradually over time as the mind processes what occurred. There's likely truth in both interpretations. It's certainly true that the military culture of the 1980s was not welcoming to claims of UFO encounters. Speaking publicly about seeing strange craft was not career enhancing, and there would have been strong incentives to downplay or minimize what happened. On the other hand, it's also true that human memory is malleable and that recollections of events can change significantly over time, incorporating new information and interpretations. One witness whose account has remained relatively consistent and who has actually become more skeptical over time is Colonel Conrad, who was the base commander at the time of the incident. Conrad was not present during any of the sightings, but he was briefed on what occurred and had access to the reports and evidence. His assessment, stated publicly in later years, was that his men had likely misidentified conventional phenomena. He didn't accuse them of lying or hallucinating, but he believed they had made an honest mistake in the dark forest. The fact that the most senior officer at the base, the one person who would have been most deeply briefed on what occurred, maintains a skeptical view is significant. Lieutenant Colonel Halt, on the other hand, has remained adamant that something truly anomalous occurred. He has stated repeatedly that what he experienced in that forest cannot be explained by lighthouses or meteors. He was there. He saw what he saw. He recorded it on tape. And no one has been able to convince him that he misinterpreted conventional phenomena. The divergence between these two senior officers' interpretations of the same events illustrates the fundamental challenge at the heart of the Rendlesham case. Two experienced military men, both with access to the same information, reach completely different conclusions about what happened. The nuclear connection. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Rendlesham Forest incident, and one that receives less attention than it perhaps deserves, is its connection to nuclear weapons. RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge housed tactical nuclear weapons in 1980, a fact that was officially secret at the time but widely known among those who served there, and has since been confirmed through declassified documents. UFO researchers have long noted a pattern of unexplained aerial phenomena occurring near nuclear facilities. From the famous Washington, D.C. sightings of 1952, which occurred near the nation's capital during the height of the Cold War, to numerous reports of strange objects observed near nuclear missile silos in the American Midwest during the 1960s and 1970s, there seems to be a correlation between nuclear weapons and UFO activity. The Rendlesham case fits this pattern. On the Halt tape, though the audio is fragmentary and sometimes difficult to interpret, there are suggestions that beams of light from the objects in the sky were directed toward the ground, specifically in the direction of the weapons storage area where nuclear weapons were kept. In later interviews, some witnesses have stated more explicitly that they believed the objects were showing particular interest in the nuclear weapons bunkers. If we accept, for the sake of argument, that the objects observed were of non-human origin, whether extraterrestrial or from some other source. Their interest in nuclear facilities might make sense. Nuclear weapons represent humanity's most destructive technology, devices capable of ending civilization and rendering the planet uninhabitable. An advanced intelligence observing Earth might well be interested in whether and how we're managing these weapons. Alternatively, if we entertain the possibility that the objects were of terrestrial but advanced origin, perhaps representing classified military technology, their presence near nuclear facilities could be related to security testing, reconnaissance, or exercises designed to test the readiness of base defenses. The nuclear connection also raises questions about the government response to the incident. If unknown objects were observed in close proximity to nuclear weapons, directing beams of light toward the storage bunkers, this would seem to constitute a serious security breach worthy of intensive investigation. The relatively muted official response, the classification of certain records, and the subsequent downplaying of the incident's significance could be interpreted as evidence that the authorities knew more than they were saying and preferred to keep the matter quiet rather than risk public alarm. Of course, it's also possible that the nuclear connection is being overemphasized. The bases housed nuclear weapons, but they also housed conventional aircraft, personnel quarters, administrative buildings, and all the other facilities of a major military installation. The presence of unexplained lights near the base doesn't necessarily mean they were specifically interested in or interacting with the nuclear weapons. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Nevertheless, the nuclear connection remains one of the more thought-provoking aspects of the case, particularly when considered in the broader context of UFO reports at nuclear facilities worldwide. Checkers witness credibility and military training. A crucial element that sets the Rendlesham Forest incident apart from many other UFO cases is the credibility of the witnesses. These weren't random civilians prone to flights of fancy. These were United States Air Force personnel, many with top-secret security clearances, tasked with protecting one of NATO's most important military installations during the height of the Cold War. The training these men received was specifically designed to make them reliable observers. Security police at a nuclear-capable base don't get nervous at every strange light or unusual sound. They're trained to distinguish between genuine threats and false alarms, to remain calm under pressure, to observe carefully, and report accurately. Their job depended on being able to tell the difference between, say, an animal moving through the brush and a genuine intruder, between an aircraft's normal navigation lights and something actually unusual. Jim Peniston, in particular, had extensive military experience by 1980. He wasn't a raw recruit fresh out of basic training. He was a senior airman, a security supervisor, someone trusted with significant responsibility. John Burroughs, while more junior, was still a trained Air Force security specialist. These men knew what aircraft looked like. They knew what helicopters sounded like. They were familiar with flares, with ground-based lights, with all the ordinary phenomena that might be encountered on and around a military base. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt's credibility is perhaps even more significant. As deputy base commander, he was one of the most senior officers at the installation. He had served in Vietnam. He had decades of military experience. He was not someone prone to panic or misidentification. When he went into that forest with a tape recorder, he was initially skeptical, expecting to find a mundane explanation for the reported lights. What he experienced changed his mind. Skeptics counter that military training, while valuable, doesn't make someone immune to misperception. They point out that even trained observers can make mistakes, particularly in unusual or stressful circumstances, particularly at night in an unfamiliar environment. They note that the human eye and brain can play tricks, making distant lights appear closer, making stationary objects appear to move, making ordinary things seem extraordinary when expectation and excitement are involved. This is absolutely true. Trained observers can make mistakes. But the skeptical argument requires us to believe that multiple trained observers, over the course of 3 separate nights, including a senior officer conducting a deliberate investigation with equipment, all made the same mistakes, all misidentified the same conventional phenomena in the same way. It's worth noting that most of the witnesses have maintained their stories for over 40 years, despite intense scrutiny, skepticism, and even ridicule. They've had nothing to gain and much to lose by sticking to their accounts. Some have been labeled as unstable or attention-seeking. Some have had their military careers judged through the lens of this incident, and yet they persist in saying that something truly unusual happened in Rendlesham Forest. Of course, persistence doesn't equal truth. People can be sincerely mistaken and remain convinced of their error for a lifetime. But when we weigh the credibility of witnesses, the training and experience of those involved, their consistency over decades, and the professional and personal costs they've incurred for maintaining their accounts, it adds weight to the case that something genuinely unusual occurred. Structure, contradictions, and inconsistencies. For all its strengths as a UFO case, Rendlesham also suffers from contradictions and inconsistencies that complicate any attempt to determine what actually happened. Some of these inconsistencies can be explained by the normal vagaries of human memory and perception. Others are more troubling and raise legitimate questions about the reliability of certain claims. One significant inconsistency involves the timeline and exact sequence of events. Different witnesses remember the timing of various incidents differently. Was the first encounter on the night of December 25th, 26, or December 26, 27? Different accounts place it on different nights, though most sources now agree it was the early hours of December 26. The confusion arose partly from the way military date-time groups work, and partly from inconsistencies in the witnesses' own recollections. The description of the craft or object seen on the first night has varied across different tellings. Some accounts describe it as metallic, others as more ceramic or stone-like in appearance. The size estimates vary. The exact color and nature of the lights have been described differently by different witnesses or by the same witnesses at different times. These variations aren't necessarily evidence of fabrication. People observe details differently, remember them differently, and describe them differently. But they do make it difficult to construct a definitive picture of what was seen. A more serious inconsistency involves the claims made by different witnesses about what happened to them after the incidents. Some witnesses claim they were subjected to interrogation, possibly even drugging and hypnotic regression by intelligence officers, though these claims are difficult to verify and are not corroborated by others. Some claim their memories were tampered with or suppressed, though again, such claims are nearly impossible to prove or disprove. The binary code story, as we've discussed, has inconsistencies built into it. The date in Peniston's notebook doesn't match when the encounter supposedly occurred. The story wasn't mentioned for 30 years, despite Peniston giving numerous interviews during that period. Other witnesses don't corroborate it, These problems don't necessarily mean nothing happened to Peniston, but they do cast doubt on the specific claim about receiving binary code through telepathic download. Another problematic area involves claims about subsequent visits to the forest site. Some accounts suggest that military personnel, possibly including intelligence officers, returned to the site multiple times in the days and weeks following the incident, conducting extensive investigations, removing soil samples, and even excavating the ground depression sites. Other accounts suggest relatively little follow-up investigation occurred. It's difficult to know which version is accurate. The involvement of British authorities, specifically the Ministry of Defense and local police, is also murky. The official position of the MOD was that they conducted no detailed investigation because the incident posed no threat to national security. But some witnesses claim that British intelligence services were involved, that there were joint US-UK briefings about the incident, and that considerable effort went into managing the situation. Without access to classified files, if such files exist, it's impossible to know the truth. These contradictions and inconsistencies don't invalidate the case. Every complex event, especially one involving multiple witnesses over multiple nights, will have inconsistencies when examined in detail. Memory is fallible. Perspectives differ. And when events are strange and frightening, people process and remember them imperfectly. But the contradictions do mean we must be careful about accepting every detail of every account at face value. Some elements of the Rendlesham story are well documented and multiply attested. Others rest on single witness claims that can't be verified. The aftermath and continuing investigation. In the years and decades following the Rendlesham Forest incident, the case has remained alive in public consciousness in a way few other UFO cases have. This is due partly to the quality of the evidence, partly to the credibility of the witnesses, and partly to the continued efforts of researchers and the witnesses themselves to keep the story in the spotlight. The forest itself, the actual location where the events occurred, has become something of a pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts. The Forestry Commission, which manages Rendlesham Forest, eventually embraced this interest, creating the UFO Trail, a marked path through the forest that takes visitors to the key locations associated with the incident. Information boards along the trail describe what reportedly happened at each location. A mock-up of the triangular craft, based on witness descriptions, was even placed in a clearing for a time, allowing visitors to get a sense of the scale of what was reported. This commercialization and touristification of the incident has drawn criticism from some quarters. Skeptics argue that it treats speculation as fact and encourages credulous belief in extraordinary claims. Some of the original witnesses have expressed mixed feelings about the trail, appreciating the recognition of their experience, but uncomfortable with how it's sometimes sensationalized. Numerous books have been written about Rendlesham, starting with Sky Crash in 1984 and continuing through multiple subsequent volumes offering different perspectives and levels of analysis. Nick Pope, who worked for the British Ministry of Defence's UFO investigation unit in the early 1990s, has written extensively about the case, arguing that it deserves to be taken seriously, even though he wasn't personally involved in any investigation at the time. Television documentaries have revisited the incident repeatedly. Ancient Aliens, the History Channel series that sees extraterrestrial explanations for virtually everything, has covered Rendlesham multiple times. More serious documentary investigations have been conducted by mainstream outlets, including British and American television networks. Some of these documentaries have taken the witnesses at their word. Others have been more skeptical. In 2010, on the 30th anniversary of the incident, several of the key witnesses gathered at the site for a press conference and commemoration. This event generated renewed media interest and led to the revelation of the binary code story. The anniversary gathering also highlighted how the witnesses' relationships with each other and their individual interpretations of the events have evolved over time. One significant development in recent years has been the increasing willingness of military and government personnel to speak openly about UFO encounters. The stigma that once attached to reporting such experiences has decreased somewhat, particularly following the Pentagon's acknowledgement in 2020 that they take reports of unidentified aerial phenomena seriously and maintain ongoing investigative efforts. This cultural shift has made it easier for Rendlesham witnesses to speak publicly without fear of being immediately dismissed as cranks. The medical acknowledgement granted to John Burroughs in 2015 discussed earlier was a significant milestone. It marked the first time the U.S. government officially connected the Rendlesham incident to measurable physical harm. While the VA disability determination carefully avoided making any statement about the cause of Burroughs' injuries beyond connecting them to his service during that period, the implications were clear enough to generate renewed interest in the case. Ian Ridpath, perhaps the case's most dedicated skeptic, has continued to maintain his website offering detailed conventional explanations for every aspect of the incident. His work is thorough and well documented, and it serves as an important counterbalance to more credulous treatments of the case. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, his meticulous documentation of facts and his analysis of the evidence represent valuable contributions to understanding what did and didn't happen. Interestingly, some researchers have noted parallels between Rendlesham and other cases, both historical and contemporary. The patterns of light behavior, the apparent interest in military installations, the physical effects reported by witnesses, all these elements appear in other well-documented UFO cases. Whether this represents a genuine pattern of some recurring phenomenon, or whether it represents a kind of cultural template that influences how people interpret and remember unusual experiences, remains debatable. Thus, cultural impact and why it matters. The Rendlesham Forest incident has become more than just a UFO case. It's become a cultural touchstone, a reference point in discussions about the reality or unreality of unexplained aerial phenomena. When British media outlets discuss UFOs, Rendlesham is almost always mentioned. It's Britain's Roswell, a phrase that immediately communicates both the fame and the controversy surrounding the case. The incident has appeared in popular culture beyond just documentary and nonfiction treatments. It's been referenced in TV shows, featured in fictionalized accounts, and used as inspiration for various creative works. The image of the triangular craft with hieroglyphic symbols, whether that image represents something real or something imagined, has become iconic in UFO imagery. For believers in the extraterrestrial hypothesis or other exotic explanations for UFOs, Rendlesham is a cornerstone case. It's used as evidence that something genuinely unknown is occurring, that trained witnesses can observe phenomena that defy conventional explanation, that physical evidence can be associated with UFO encounters, and that governments may know more than they publicly acknowledge. The case is seen as demonstrating that UFO experiences are not limited to unreliable witnesses or ambiguous evidence. For skeptics, Rendlesham demonstrates how even good witnesses can be mistaken, how conventional phenomena can be misinterpreted under certain conditions, and how a relatively simple series of misidentifications can balloon into an elaborate mythology when combined with time, attention, and the human tendency to find patterns and meaning in ambiguous events. The truth, as is so often the case, likely lies somewhere in the middle ground between these extremes. Something happened in Rendlesham Forest in December 1980. Multiple trained observers saw something unusual. Physical evidence was present at the scene. Official documentation exists. These are facts. What those facts mean, what actually caused the observations and evidence, remains subject to interpretation and debate. What makes Rendlesham matter, beyond the specific question of what happened that night, is what it tells us about how we evaluate unusual claims, how we weigh evidence, and how we deal with experiences that don't fit neatly into our existing categories of understanding. It's a case study in epistemology, in how we know what we know, and how certain we can be about our conclusions. The case also highlights the challenges of official transparency regarding unusual incidents. The initial classification of aspects of the case, the reluctance of authorities to investigate thoroughly, the classification of medical records. All these elements feed suspicion that governments are hiding information about UFO encounters. Whether that suspicion is justified, or whether it reflects a misunderstanding of how bureaucracies actually function, is part of the ongoing debate. For the people of Suffolk, and specifically the area around Rendlesham Forest, the incident has become part of local identity. The forest attracts visitors who might never have come otherwise. Local businesses benefit from the UFO tourism. Signs pointing to the UFO trail are now part of the landscape. Whether locals believe something extraordinary happened or think the whole thing is overblown, they're aware of the story and its place in their region's history. Government secrecy and freedom of information. One of the enduring frustrations for researchers investigating the Rendlesham Forest incident has been the difficulty in obtaining complete official records of what happened and how authorities responded. While the Halt memo was released through Freedom of Information requests, and while various other documents have emerged over the years, there remains a sense among some researchers that significant information remains classified or restricted. The classification of John Burroughs' medical records, mentioned earlier, is one example of official secrecy that seems difficult to justify on routine security grounds. Medical records of enlisted personnel are not typically classified. The fact that his records from that period were classified suggests that something in those records, or something about what happened to him during that period, was deemed sensitive enough to restrict access. Even after his disability was granted, the specific medical details that led to that decision remain non-public. In 2001, the British government conducted a comprehensive study of UFO phenomena, eventually released in 2006 as the Condign Report. This classified study, conducted for the Defense Intelligence Staff, concluded that many UFO reports could be explained as misidentification of rare atmospheric plasma phenomena. The report briefly mentioned Rendlesham, suggesting it might be explained by this plasma hypothesis, though the analysis was cursory and not particularly convincing to those familiar with the details of the case. The British Ministry of Defense closed its official UFO investigation unit in 2009, stating that in over 50 years of collecting reports, they had found no evidence that UFO sightings posed any threat to national security, and therefore saw no value in continuing to dedicate resources to the subject. The closure meant that subsequent researchers had even fewer official channels through which to seek information about historical cases like Rendlesham. In recent years, particularly following the U.S. military's acknowledgement of ongoing investigations into unidentified aerial phenomena and the release of declassified videos showing encounters between military aircraft and unknown objects, there has been renewed pressure on both American and British authorities to be more transparent about historical UFO cases. Some Rendlesham researchers have hoped that additional documents might be declassified as time passes, and the Cold War context that justified much of the original secrecy becomes less relevant. However, to date, no major new document releases have significantly changed our understanding of the case. Either such documents don't exist, or they remain classified for reasons that have not been publicly explained. The secrecy, or perceived secrecy, surrounding Rendlesham contributes to its enduring fascination. It's natural for people to suspect that if governments won't fully disclose what they know, it's because they know something significant that they're choosing to hide. Whether this suspicion is justified, or whether it simply reflects the bureaucratic reality that governments don't release everything they have on every topic, is part of the ongoing debate. Comparing Rendlesham to other famous cases. To put the Rendlesham Forest incident in context, it's useful to compare it to other well-known UFO cases. How does it measure up in terms of evidence quality, witness credibility, and overall persuasiveness? The Roswell incident of 1947, to which Rendlesham is often compared, involves the reported crash and recovery of an unknown craft near Roswell, New Mexico. The Roswell case has become perhaps the most famous UFO incident in history, but it suffers from significant evidentiary problems. The main events occurred in 1947, but most of the detailed accounts and extraordinary claims didn't emerge until decades later, in the 1970s and 1980s. There are no contemporaneous documents describing alien bodies or exotic materials comparable to the Halt memo. The military's explanation that the debris was from a classified Project Mogul balloon array is plausible, if not entirely satisfying to all researchers. In terms of documented evidence created at the time of the events, Rendlesham is actually stronger than Roswell. The Belgian UFO wave of 1989-1990 involved numerous sightings of triangular craft over Belgium, including radar confirmations and photographs. Belgian military officials took the sightings seriously and conducted investigations. Like Rendlesham, the Belgian wave involved credible witnesses, including police officers and military personnel. Unlike Rendlesham, however, the Belgian sightings were observed over a wide area by many different witnesses on multiple occasions, making them harder to attribute to localized misidentification. On the other hand, Rendlesham has the advantage of physical trace evidence and the Halt tape recording made during the actual events. The Phoenix Lights incident of 1997 involved thousands of witnesses across Arizona observing unusual lights in formation moving across the sky. The sheer number of witnesses makes Phoenix Lights impressive, but the photographic and video evidence is ambiguous, and mundane explanations involving military flares have been proposed. Rendlesham, with far fewer witnesses, but more detailed close-range observations and physical evidence, presents a different kind of case. The USS Nimitz encounters of 2004, which came to public attention in 2017 when the Pentagon released declassified videos, involve military radar operators and fighter pilots observing objects performing maneuvers that seem to defy known physics. These cases have the advantage of multiple sensor confirmations, radar data, and infrared video, in addition to eyewitness testimony from highly trained observers. Like Rendlesham, they involve military witnesses with high credibility. Unlike Rendlesham, they lack physical trace evidence but benefit from multiple forms of technical data. When we place Rendlesham in this context, its strengths become clear. It has contemporaneous official documentation in the form of the Halt memo. It has a real-time audio recording of events as they unfolded. It has multiple military witnesses, including senior officers. It has reported physical trace evidence. It has the intriguing detail of medical consequences for at least one witness that the government has acknowledged. In terms of the overall package of evidence, Rendlesham ranks among the strongest cases in the history of UFO research. Where Rendlesham is weaker than some other cases is in the clarity of what was observed. The Nimitz videos, for instance, show something on infrared that moves in unusual ways, whatever it is. The Phoenix lights were witnessed by thousands, seeing the same thing at the same time. Rendlesham involves confusing observations in a dark forest, lights seen through trees, and descriptions that have evolved over time. The physical evidence is ambiguous, potentially explained by conventional causes. The case is strong, but not conclusive, compelling, but not definitive. Mavr, alternative theories, beyond extraterrestrial. While much of the discussion around Rendlesham assumes an extraterrestrial explanation if we reject conventional causes, there are other theoretical frameworks that have been proposed to explain what might have occurred. One alternative that has gained some traction, particularly following Peniston's binary code revelation with its reference to the year 8100, is the time traveler hypothesis. This theory suggests that the craft and beings encountered were not from another planet, but from Earth's own future. Human time travelers, according to this speculation, might be visiting historically significant moments or conducting research on their own past. The hieroglyphic symbols could be a future form of human writing. The telepathic communication could be advanced human technology. The interest in nuclear weapons sites could reflect future humans concerned about the pivotal decisions made during the Cold War that shaped the future they inherited. This theory has some appealing aspects. It would explain why any communications would be in forms comprehensible to humans, why the beings would have an interest in human affairs and human history, and why they might not want to interfere too overtly. It also sidesteps some of the challenging questions about interstellar travel. However, the time traveler hypothesis has its own significant problems, not least the fact that time travel to the past faces apparently insurmountable theoretical obstacles according to our current understanding of physics, and the whole framework rests on Peniston's binary code story, which, as we've discussed, has serious credibility issues. Another alternative is the interdimensional hypothesis, which suggests that UFOs might not be traveling through space from distant planets, but rather accessing our reality from parallel dimensions or alternate realities. This framework, popular among some researchers, would explain why UFOs seem to appear and disappear in ways that defy our understanding of physics. why they sometimes seem more like apparitions than solid craft, and why their behavior often seems absurd or theatrical rather than following the logical patterns we'd expect from extraterrestrial explorers. The interdimensional hypothesis is difficult to evaluate because it's based on speculative physics and makes predictions that are hard to test. It has the advantage of being flexible enough to encompass almost any observed UFO behavior, but that same flexibility makes it unfalsifiable and therefore scientifically problematic. Some researchers have proposed that certain UFO encounters, particularly those involving physical effects and apparent communication, might be related to consciousness or altered states of perception. This framework suggests that the witnesses at Rendlesham might have experienced a genuine phenomenon, but one that exists at the intersection of physical reality and human consciousness, something that can't be fully captured by either conventional scientific instruments or by subjective experience alone. This consciousness-related explanation could account for the mixing of apparently objective effects, the physical traces, the radiation readings, the multiple witnesses, with apparently subjective elements like the telepathic download Peniston reports or the time distortion experienced by the witnesses. However, like the interdimensional hypothesis, this framework is difficult to test rigorously and risks explaining everything by explaining nothing. A more prosaic alternative theory, though one that still avoids the conventional skeptical explanation, is that Rendlesham might have involved classified military technology, either American or possibly Soviet. During the Cold War, both superpowers were developing advanced aircraft and conducting secret tests. Could the craft observed have been some kind of experimental vehicle, perhaps using unconventional propulsion or stealth technology? This explanation would account for the government's reluctance to fully disclose what happened and for the classification of certain records. If the incident involved classified military technology, whether in an intentional test or an accidental exposure, keeping it secret would be a priority. The problem with this theory is that it requires the classified technology of 1980 to have been far beyond what we know existed at the time, so advanced that even 40 years later, nothing comparable has entered public knowledge. Additionally, if the craft was American, why were American personnel at an American-operated base not briefed about it? Why would you test exotic aircraft over your own nuclear weapons storage area, risking a security incident? If the craft was Soviet, representing some kind of intelligence operation or provocation, why didn't the incident trigger a more aggressive response from NATO? Each alternative explanation has its adherents, and each has logical problems. What they all share is an attempt to explain the apparently anomalous aspects of Rendlesham without requiring us to accept that we were visited by extraterrestrial beings, which remains the most culturally loaded and scientifically challenging explanation. The human element. Lives changed forever. Beyond the evidence, beyond the debates about what happened or didn't happen, the Rendlesham Forest incident is ultimately a story about people whose lives were fundamentally changed by a few nights in December 1980. For Jim Peniston, John Burroughs, and the other witnesses, the incident became a defining element of their identities. They became known as the Rendlesham Witnesses. Their military service, their subsequent careers, their relationships, all were filtered through the lens of these events. Some of them have embraced this identity, speaking at conferences, writing books, giving interviews. Others have been more reluctant, speaking about their experiences, but wishing they could move on from an event that occurred when many of them were very young men. John Burroughs has spoken about the difficulty of knowing that something extraordinary happened to him, but not fully understanding what it was. He knows he was there. He knows what he experienced. He knows his health was affected, but he doesn't have all the answers. And living with that uncertainty, with knowing that a pivotal experience of your life remains unexplained, takes a psychological toll. Charles Halt has remained one of the case's most vocal advocates, arguing consistently that what he experienced was real and significant. For Halt, a career military officer, the incident represents an enduring frustration. He reported what he observed through proper channels. He documented it carefully. He expected it to be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Instead, it was largely dismissed or minimized. For a man trained to follow procedures and trust in the system, this response has been deeply unsatisfying. The other witnesses, those less prominently featured in the public story, have had their own journeys. Some have come forward over the years to add their accounts. Some have chosen to remain silent, not wanting the attention or controversy. Some have watched the case evolve and grow in the public imagination with mixed feelings, seeing their experiences becoming part of a larger narrative that sometimes feels divorced from what they actually lived through. The families of these men have also been affected. Spouses and children have had to deal with the attention, the skepticism, the conspiracy theories. They've had to watch their loved ones relive traumatic experiences, defend their credibility, and struggle with events that occurred decades ago but remain present and unresolved. For the local community around Rendlesham Forest, the incident has become part of their collective history. Older residents remember the activity at the bases during those December nights. They remember the increased military presence, the helicopters, the strange atmosphere. Whether they believe something extraordinary occurred or think it was all overblown, the incident is part of what happened in their community, a piece of local lore. The case has also affected the careers and lives of researchers and investigators who have dedicated years to understanding what happened. People like Ian Ridpath, who has spent decades documenting the conventional explanations, or Nick Pope, who has written extensively about the case from a more open-minded perspective. For these researchers, Rendlesham represents a complex puzzle, a test of investigative methods, and a window into how we evaluate unusual claims. What's often lost in debates about evidence and explanations is this human dimension. Real people experience something that frightened them, confused them, and changed them. Whether that something was a genuine encounter with unknown phenomena or a cascade of misidentifications and psychological effects, the impact on those individuals was real and lasting. This is true of many UFO cases, but it's particularly poignant in Rendlesham because we can follow the witnesses' journeys over decades. We can see how the experience has shaped them, how their understanding of it has evolved, how they've dealt with belief and skepticism, validation and dismissal. Their stories remind us that behind every UFO case, beyond all the debate about evidence and explanations, there are human beings trying to make sense of experiences that defy easy understanding. Yahurasan, the broader implications. If we step back from the specific details of the Rendlesham Forest incident and consider what it might mean in a broader context, several implications emerge depending on which interpretation we favor. If something genuinely anomalous occurred at Rendlesham, if the conventional explanations are insufficient, and we must accept that an unknown phenomenon or intelligence was involved, the implications are profound. It would mean that trained military observers at a secure installation during the Cold War encountered something that current science cannot explain. It would suggest that such encounters may be more common than officially acknowledged. It would raise questions about what governments know about these phenomena and why they're not more transparent about it. The presence of physical effects, particularly the medical consequences acknowledged in John Burroughs' case, would suggest that these encounters are not merely observational curiosities, but can have real, measurable impacts on human health. This raises significant concerns about the safety of military personnel and civilians who might encounter similar phenomena. The apparent interest in nuclear weapons facilities, if that element of the case is accurate, would suggest that whatever intelligence or force is behind these phenomena is aware of and concerned with humanity's most destructive technology. This could be interpreted as reassuring. Perhaps some external intelligence is monitoring to ensure we don't destroy ourselves, or alarming, suggesting vulnerability in our most secure military installations. On the other hand, if the skeptical explanation is correct and the Rendlesham incident was indeed a series of misidentifications and misperceptions, the implications are different but still significant. It would demonstrate that even trained military observers at high security installations can make serious mistakes in identification and assessment. This has implications for military readiness and the reliability of observational reports. It would also tell us something about how unusual experiences, even when mistaken, can shape lives and spawn enduring mysteries. The persistence of the Rendlesham case, despite plausible conventional explanations, would illustrate how psychological, social, and cultural factors can transform ambiguous events into powerful narratives that resist debunking. From a scientific perspective, regardless of which explanation is correct, Rendlesham highlights the challenges of investigating transient phenomena that don't leave clear, unambiguous evidence. How do we evaluate witness testimony when physical evidence is ambiguous? How do we distinguish between genuine anomalies and misidentifications? What level of proof is required before we accept that something outside our current understanding has occurred? The case also illuminates the difficulties of investigating incidents that occur within military contexts, where secrecy, classification, and security concerns can limit access to information and witnesses. Some of the enduring questions about Rendlesham might be answered if all relevant classified documents were released, but the likelihood of that happening, particularly for incidents involving nuclear weapons facilities, is low. For the UFO research community, Rendlesham represents both a pinnacle and a frustration. It's one of the best documented cases, with official records, military witnesses, and physical evidence. If this case, with all its strengths, still doesn't prove definitively that something extraordinary occurred, it raises the question of what kind of evidence ever could be sufficient. On the other hand, if Rendlesham can be explained conventionally despite its impressive evidential foundation, it suggests that other, less well-documented cases are even less likely to represent genuine anomalies. The unanswered questions. After more than 40 years of investigation, research, debate, and analysis, the Rendlesham Forest incident still leaves us with fundamental unanswered questions. What exactly did Jim Penniston and John Burroughs' encounter in the forest on that first night? Was it a physical craft of unknown origin, or was it a combination of conventional phenomena misperceived in darkness and stress? If it was a physical craft, where did it come from, and what was its purpose? If it was misperception, what exactly were they seeing? What accounts for the physical traces found at the site? Were the ground depressions landing marks from a craft, or were they rabbit holes and natural soil features? Were the tree damages evidence of something large moving through the forest, or normal forestry markings and broken branches? What were the lights that Charles Halt and his team observed and chased through the forest on the second night? Was it the Orford Ness lighthouse beam seen through trees, combined with stars and possibly aircraft? If so, how did experienced military personnel fail to identify these familiar objects? Or were they tracking something genuinely unusual, something that could hover, move, divide, and project beams of light? What caused the elevated radiation readings? Were they meaningless variations at the low end of the detector's range, or were they evidence of unusual energy at the depression sites? What about John Burroughs' heart condition? Was it coincidental, a natural medical condition that happened to develop in someone who happened to be at Rendlesham? Or was it genuinely caused by exposure to something during the incident? If the latter, what was he exposed to? What's the truth about the binary code? Did Peniston genuinely experience some form of telepathic download? Or is this a false memory or conscious fabrication created decades later? If he did receive a message, why did he keep it secret for 30 years? If he didn't, why make such a claim when it can only damage his credibility? What do classified records, if they exist, contain? Are there documents we haven't seen that would answer questions or raise new ones? What's in John Burroughs' classified medical records? Why were they classified in the first place? Were there other witnesses who haven't come forward? The incident occurred at a major military installation with hundreds of personnel. Are there others who saw things those nights, but have chosen to remain silent? What would their accounts add to our understanding? What was the full extent of the official response and investigation? We know about the Halt memo and the Ministry of Defense's cursory review. But were there other investigations, either American or British, that remained classified or unknown? Did intelligence agencies investigate? Did they reach conclusions they haven't shared? These questions may never be fully answered. Time passes, memories fade, documents are destroyed or remain classified, witnesses die. The window for definitive answers grows smaller with each passing year. The enduring mystery. As we come to the end of this exploration of the Rendlesham Forest incident, we're left with a case that resists simple resolution. It's a mystery that has endured for over 4 decades, and it shows no signs of being conclusively solved anytime soon. For those who believe something genuinely anomalous occurred, Rendlesham represents one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that we are not alone, that something unknown shares our world or visits it, and that the truth about these phenomena is more complex than official pronouncements suggest. The case offers them validation, a thoroughly documented instance where dismissing the witnesses requires explaining away too much credible testimony and evidence. For skeptics, Rendlesham demonstrates how even good evidence, good witnesses, and official documentation can surround events that ultimately have prosaic explanations. It shows how UFO narratives develop and grow, how initial misidentifications can spawn elaborate mythologies, and how the human need for mystery and meaning can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. For those who remain genuinely uncertain, sitting in that uncomfortable middle ground where neither full acceptance nor full dismissal feels appropriate, Rendlesham represents the maddening complexity of trying to evaluate anomalous claims. It's a case where you can see the arguments on both sides, where intelligent and informed people reach opposite conclusions, where the evidence is substantial but ambiguous. What we can say with confidence is that something happened in Rendlesham Forest in December 1980. Multiple credible witnesses experienced events they found deeply unusual and disturbing. Physical traces were found. Official reports were filed. Lives were changed. These are facts, documented and verified. What we cannot say with confidence is what caused these observations and experiences. We cannot definitively state whether the witnesses encountered a craft of unknown origin, whether they misidentified conventional phenomena under unusual circumstances, or whether some combination of factors created an experience that was part genuine anomaly and part misperception. The Rendlesham Forest incident endures not because it provides clear answers, but because it asks compelling questions. Questions about perception and reality, about the reliability of witnesses, about the possibility of phenomena beyond our current understanding, about government transparency, about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. Perhaps the most important thing the case teaches us is humility. Humility in the face of events we don't fully understand. Humility about the limitations of our knowledge and our ability to always distinguish truth from error. Humility about the complexity of investigation and the challenges of reaching definitive conclusions about transient events that leave ambiguous evidence. The forest remains. The trees that stood witness to whatever occurred that December night still stand, or their descendants do. The Rendlesham UFO trail winds through the woods, allowing visitors to walk the paths the witnesses walked, to stand in the clearings where they stood, to imagine what they might have seen and felt. The witnesses who are still with us continue to tell their stories, to insist on the reality of their experiences, to push back against skepticism and dismissal. They were there. They know what they saw, even if they don't fully understand it. That knowledge, that certainty born of direct experience, keeps the case alive. And researchers continue to investigate, to analyze, to debate, to search for new evidence or new interpretations of old evidence. The Rendlesham Forest incident has become a touchstone, a case that serious UFO researchers must grapple with, a test of methods and theories. The jury's conclusion, the search for truth. As we conclude our journey through the Rendlesham Forest incident, it's worth reflecting on what the case tells us about our relationship with the unknown and our search for truth. We live in an age of information, where facts are supposedly at our fingertips, where mysteries are solved with a quick internet search. But cases like Rendlesham remind us that some questions resist easy answers, that some mysteries endure despite our best efforts to solve them. The Rendlesham Forest incident sits at the intersection of several powerful human concerns. It touches on our fundamental question: are we alone in the universe? It raises issues of trust in authority and government transparency. It challenges our understanding of perception and reality. It forces us to confront the limitations of evidence and the difficulties of knowing truth. For all the investigation, all the analysis, all the debate, we still don't know definitively what happened in those woods 40-some years ago. We have theories, explanations, beliefs, but knowledge, genuine certain knowledge, remains elusive. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to endure, to continue challenging us, to resist the complacency of certainty. The questions raised by Rendlesham about what's possible, about what's real, about how we know what we know, are questions worth continuing to ask, even if we never fully answer them. The men who were there that December night know what they experienced, even if they don't fully understand it. That experience was real to them, whatever its ultimate cause or nature. Their willingness to come forward, to share their stories despite skepticism and ridicule, reflects a courage that deserves respect, even if we question their conclusions. The skeptics who have worked to provide conventional explanations are performing a valuable service, keeping us grounded, demanding evidence, insisting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Their work ensures that we don't leap to fantastical conclusions without fully exploring more prosaic possibilities. The researchers and investigators, whether they lean toward anomalous or conventional explanations, are engaging in the fundamental human activity of trying to understand our world and our experiences. Their efforts to document, analyze, and comprehend the Rendlesham case contribute to our larger project of making sense of reality. For you, the listener, wherever you fall on the spectrum of belief and skepticism about the Rendlesham Forest incident, I hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of the case and the questions it raises. Whether you come away convinced that something truly extraordinary happened, or confident that conventional explanations suffice, or simply more uncertain than when you began, that's the appropriate response to a genuinely complex case. The Rendlesham Forest is still there in Suffolk, its pines and oaks standing silent watch over the secrets they witnessed. The bases where American airmen once guarded nuclear weapons are now closed, returned to British control, and repurposed or abandoned. The Cold War that provided the context for these events is over, its tensions and fears now largely historical curiosities. But the mystery endures. The questions remain. And somewhere, perhaps, in the intersection between what we know and what we don't, between what's proven and what's possible, lies the truth about what happened during those 3 extraordinary nights in December 1980. The search for that truth continues. The debate goes on. The story, like all the best mysteries, remains unfinished, inviting each new generation to examine the evidence, consider the possibilities, and reach their own conclusions about the Rendlesham Forest incident, Britain's most famous UFO mystery. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most fascinating and well-documented UFO cases in history. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Rendlesham Forest incident, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth investigations into mysteries, unexplained phenomena, and the strange stories that challenge our understanding of the world. Your support helps me continue to bring you these thoroughly researched, long-form explorations of the topics that fascinate us all. Until next time, keep looking up, keep asking questions, and keep searching for truth in the shadows of the unknown.